Dr. Sasha Dovzhyk is a London-based author from Zaporizhzhia and a special projects curator at the Ukrainian Institute London. She is now in Lviv, and we will talk a bit more about her future roles in a minute. She holds research affiliations with Goldsmiths and Birkbeck, University of London. Since February 2022, she has been dividing her time between London and Ukraine, and as I say, now is permanently in Ukraine as well. She is also a prolific writer and has written on topics as diverse as the legacies of Chernobyl, transnational decadent aesthetics, and Ukrainian literature for various publications, including the Los Angeles Review of Books, The Guardian, CNN, The Ecologist, openDemocracy, and others. Sasha regularly gives public talks, interviews, and moderates events on topics such as Ukraine's fight against the Russian invasion, as well as Ukrainian traditions of resistance. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like, subscribe, and definitely comment to help other people find our fantastic videos. Sasha, welcome back to the channel. I am absolutely delighted to be able to speak to you for the second time.
Thank you, Jonathan, and I'm delighted to be here for the second time. It's an honor.
And this is the last interview of the year. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to dig through what has happened over the year, but also look forward to what needs to happen to ensure a Ukrainian victory in 2024.
That's a good plan. I don't think that I have all my points straight because it's been a few quite busy days here in Lviv with the most massive air raid in a long time, maybe the most massive air raid since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And people are a bit unnerved and a bit sleep deprived, but I'll try to do my best.
And I absolutely appreciate that. Actually, it's quite a difficult time. I didn't have any interviews scheduled straight after the bombardment, because I think it's very difficult for people to collect their thoughts. And this definitely, I think the missile count just seems to be going up and up. So I think it does count as the largest bombardment. And is there any point in asking why? I mean, it clearly seems to be linked to the spectacular sinking of the landing ship Novocherkassk. And I suspect the order for this must have been given from the top, from the diminutive, quite inadequate little man that occupies the Red Fortress. Is there any doubt that this is Putin's attempt at a kind of revenge for his bruised and damaged ego?
As always, I'm a bit reluctant to think about what motivates Russians and what motivates Vladimir Putin, because like their mindlessness is a mystery to me. They have used terror throughout the full-scale invasion as a weapon of war, terror directed against civilian population of Ukraine. And I think they are going back to this tactic because for a couple of months we had less of these massive bombardments throughout Ukraine. But now they're back at their usual, and I think nobody in Ukraine is surprised. We have been prepared that during the coldest and the darkest winter months, when our natural defenses go down, Russians will try to hit again, will try to deprive us of sleep, electricity, and heating, and whatever, just to deflate the morale. But I don't think that they are succeeding with this. The reaction, as usual, is anger, and anger is quite powerful motivating factor. So yesterday, after Lviv was like heavily hit with Russian missiles, and we spent maybe 4 hours in bomb shelters or just listening to the town exploding around us, people went back to work, and I went to a dentist in the morning. After a sleepless night, the doctor was in his office and was operating as per usual. And after that, I went to my work. Everyone was in the office, although Obviously, conversations were centered on the night attack. And after that, I went to a beautiful poetry reading by one of the best Ukrainian poets, Helena Kruk, who just said bye to her husband, who went back to fight on the front lines. So this is basically the spirit of the place, the spirit of the people. They are keeping at what they are best at and are trying to resist in whatever way they can. And this has not changed as far as I can notice.
And this is, I think, worth pointing out that Russia has been stockpiling these missiles because the volume of attacks has decreased. Based on previous strikes that Ukraine has successfully mounted against various launch sites within Crimea, and of course, a whole range of cruise missile ships have been sunk and damaged. There has been a far sort of lower incidence of strikes and far lower incidence of successful strikes as well, with increased Patriot missile coverage and Provo sort of coverage in a variety of cities. So Russia stockpiles all this stuff together, and rather than trying to hit something that would damage the war effort, it simply strikes at civilians. I mean, not only is that absolutely desperate and cruel and barbaric, does it also perhaps suggest that they really have no concept of a victory from this point on? They're willing to throw away their men, their materials, their vehicles, their missiles on basically just terrorizing people. There's no strategic objective and perhaps no hope of actually achieving any further strategic objectives.
I'm not sure how it looks from the outside, but in Ukraine, we do try to concentrate on the things we've managed to achieve with quite limited means during this past year. And one of the main achievements of the past year is obviously drastically reducing the numbers of the Russian fleet in Crimea and in the Black Sea. And we were able to renew the exports from Ukrainian ports after Russia bombarded them. And we were able to push away Russian warships either to the bottom of the Black Sea or away from the Black Sea to places from which they cannot bombard and terrorize Ukrainian civilians. This was great. As far as Russian war tactics is concerned, I think that they insist on the meat grinder approach to the war, where they just don't count their losses. Every day we get the renewed statistics from Ukrainian military officers, from Ukrainian military, about how much they have reduced the overall number of Russian troops. And the number is usually between 800 and 1,000 of men lost at the battlefield. The idea that this amount of loss of manpower, of human life, would stop Russia, would make them reconsider the viability of this war. This idea has not proved, has not actually been shown right. Russians do not count their losses, and they don't mind losing people at the battlefield in this mindless meat grinder. I think that Ukrainian commanders were surprised by this, but now they are taking this into account. It's quite different in Ukraine. We do value all our soldiers' lives. We cannot put them through the meat grinder. The nature of the Ukrainian army is quite different, because it's massively reliant on civilians who just put on their uniforms in February 2022 and joined the armed forces of Ukraine. So among my acquaintances, there are poets, film directors, scholars, teachers, restaurateurs, writers who have joined the armed forces of Ukraine and who are now serving in the hottest places on the battlefield. Obviously, these people are like part of the Ukrainian civilian society, and their lives as well as the lives of the Ukrainian military, who have been in the military for the past decade and have been fighting Russia since its actual invasion in 2014, are priceless to us. So our tactics have to be different, and we have to rely on technology, and we have to rely on smarter ways of actually conducting this counteroffensive or offensive in Ukraine. And for that, we rely on the support of our allies. I know that some people of Ukraine prefer to call them partners, but I don't think we are in the business logic kind of situation, and I prefer to call them allies. People in the UK, in the US, in the EU, and outside of the so-called West, who believe in democracy and who believe that Russia has to be stopped from advancing in Ukraine, has to be defeated, dismantled, and disarmed. So we do rely on the support of our allies to provide us with the means to conduct this war smartly and without losing the priceless lives of our defenders. And to be honest, Jonathan, the past few months have been quite dispiriting in this respect, because we have seen the stalling of military and financial aid to Ukraine in the US, in the EU. We have seen the protests, so-called, of the Polish truck drivers at the borders, who actually stopped the vans moving into Ukraine, and these vans obviously carried quite vital aid, both humanitarian and military, into the country. And all these movements and all this political discord outside of Ukraine has been disencouraging and disempowering more than most things that Russians can do on the front lines, because you know, we are doing our best. Ukrainians are fighting and already defending with their lives their country, my life, the peaceful life of Ukrainian cities away from the front lines. But they do need unity outside of Ukraine to continue doing this. And if they are just thrown under the bus and are left with no means of defending the country and of taking back territories, I don't think that we can continue resisting. Ukrainians will continue fighting, but the result will probably be not the Ukrainian victory we are looking forward to.
Or else a very elongated, so-called an actual stalemate, not the sort of hollow press term or the lazy press term that has been used this year for stalemate. We'll examine that in a minute, because I want to undermine this narrative of stalemate to describe 2023. But I want to turn back, and we'll also talk about the importance of Europe, because European aid is clearly being blocked by Putin's agents, Hungary, but there is a determination to bypass them and to make that happen. The US seems to be far more complex in terms of its issues in getting aid provided. And there are plenty of people on both sides who believe it's absolutely imperative for this to happen. But there's also perhaps a mindset or a policy, a psychology behind the policies in the US, which are kind of worrying, have become clearer and clearer and clearer over the last few months. Well, we'll come to all of those. But I wanted to ask one thing, and this is, you know, whenever people, even pro-Ukrainian people, get dispirited, say, but, you know, there's still corruption, there's still this, there's still problems, etc., etc. I tried to point to one fundamental thing, and I think you've touched on it there. That is that in government and in the military, despite all the issues and inefficiencies and mistakes which inevitably happen, in a vast war such as this one. I think you've touched on something which has to be, people have to be reminded of, and that is the military and the government have a sense that they are responsible to the people, and that if they diverge from that sense of responsibility, if they use people's lives and material wastefully, they will be held to account. So could you describe this mechanism, this feedback loop between people and their representatives? Because I think it's very important that people understand that that is a fundamentally different mechanic within Ukrainian society, and that doesn't exist at all in Russia. There is no feedback loop. The best you can hope in Russia is to create a begging video to the Tsar and pray that he pays attention. But unlikely he believes, and it's unlikely he'll watch any of those videos. And if he does, you're more likely to get an FSB officer turning up at your door and beating you senseless, rather than actually carrying out your sort of begging missive. So could you describe that mechanic? 'Cause it's an absolutely crucial difference between Ukraine and Russia.
Yes, I've been I've been thinking that I'm turning into a Ukrainian boomer these days who is always preaching the ethics of the Maidan to the young generation and to people outside of Ukraine as well. So just to remind our listeners that Maidan, or the Revolution of Dignity, is a revolution that took place in Ukraine in 2013, 2014, when our corrupt president, Viktor Yanukovych, tried to implement the Russian model of governance in Ukraine. So he was expected to sign an association with the European Union, and instead he cancelled it at the very last minute, and sort of turned away from the West and directed his gaze towards Russia. In response to this, maybe a couple of dozens of protesters went out in Kyiv to the main square, Maidan, and stayed there and protested against this decision. Maybe I'm a bit unfair to them. There were definitely a couple of hundred people. And they had a peaceful picket, and at some point the picket was brutally dispersed by the riot police. In response to this, to seeing these scenes of violence on our screens, people in Kyiv went out in hundreds of thousands to the street in a sign of protest against this brutal violence against peaceful demonstrators in the center of the Ukrainian capital. And they stayed on the main square for 3 months. Their demands changed from, the association with the European Union, from our government upholding this promise to the Ukrainian people. The demands changed to actually the dismissal of the government and to new elections. Yanukovych and his crew tried to beat us up. The Maidan stood for 3 months. More than 100 people were killed in this brutal fight between the people and the government, and it ended with Yanukovych, the president, fleeing the country. He fled to Russia and stayed there, and we haven't heard from him since. In Ukraine, there is this revolutionary tradition. The feedback that our government gets from the people is quite harsh, and people know that there is this last instrument that they always have. They can go to the streets, they can protest, and the government will be either listening to them, or it will just inherit the fate of Yanukovych. And like these days as well, there are still protests in the country, by which I mean not a revolution, obviously it would be suicidal at this point, but people go to the streets and they voice their concerns and their demands to the government. For example, Recently, when I was in Kyiv at the beginning of December, there was a protest in front of the Kyiv city administration against the direction of municipal budget towards some cosmetic repairs in the city. People demanded the budget to be directed, the money to be directed towards supporting the war efforts. And I'm sure that this kind of feedback loop will persist in Ukraine, because Ukraine is a democracy, and we are not ready to lose this power of our voice, even under the conditions of full-scale invasion.
And I think one of the things that threatened Russia was that the spirit of Maidan, the sort of spirit of self-organization, is not just centered on Kiev, not just on, Lviv. Ironically, I was called by someone last week from the Donbass. He called me a Lviv nationalist because I've got so extreme. But that spirit of Maidan, that spirit of holding your government and officials accountable, that spirit of seeing a problem and trying to resolve it yourselves rather than waiting for someone else to come and fix it, that actually has spread east into Donbass itself prior to the full-scale invasion. And I suspect that even in the occupied territories, that still exists repressed, ready to bounce back out again. That is a threat to Russia, isn't it? Because there it sees not just what it would see as these crazy Ukrainians, but actually people it classes as Russian speakers and mistakenly labels as Russians, also developing this spirit of resistance, independence, self-reliance. That is the real threat to the Russian vertical system.
Let me tell you a story about Russian speakers. So I come from Zaporizhzhia in the southeast of Ukraine, which is a Russified city, let's be clear. All my classmates were Russian speaking. When we were 15, 16 years old, so in the last grades of school, another revolution took place in Ukraine, which was called the Orange Revolution, when people protested against the hijacking of the elections by the corrupt president, Viktor Yanukovych, and we actually managed to make him admit to the re-election, and we elected the president democratically without this election lottery, who was Viktor Yushchenko. So when we were in our last grade, there was this Orange Revolution taking place, and in Zaporizhzhia, which is, again, Russified, and at that point was pro-Russian leaning, there still was a nucleus, a revolutionary nucleus in the city, who went out with protests with these orange flags, supporting their candidate of choice, Viktor Yushchenko. And we obviously went to the main square, and we participated as well as we could, just stood hanged out in the square and looked what was going on. Despite like this, I thought that my classmates, people I grew up with, would be less pro-Ukrainian, more pro-Russian, because I was also in the trap of this imperialist thinking. We're close to Russia, we speak Russian, and maybe my classmates and their families, unlike myself, also have this like pro-Russian sentiment. Fast forward 2013, 2014, my classmates joined the Revolution of Dignity. They join the Maidan. They either protest in Zaporizhzhia, or they drive or catch a train to Kyiv and stay in the square, and also express this will to be aligned with the EU, with democratic values, and not with these Russian narratives. Fast forward 10 years, we are in 2023. All of my classmates, without exception, are fighting on the front lines. All of them. Avdiivka, Bakhmut, the northern border of Ukraine. We stay in touch. And all of these kids from a Russified city, from their Russian-speaking families, who seemed a little bit ambiguous and ambivalent, are now defending Ukrainian statehood. So like language or even proximity to the Russian border defines nothing. It's the values that people uphold and are ready to defend that matter here. And I myself am always in awe of these boys, these teenagers, as I remember them, who are now actually doing the most important and the most crucial job of fighting for our continued existence.
That's very heartening to hear, absolutely. And of course, there will be a challenge for those people who've been under occupation. Some of them have been in the Russian information sphere, bombarded by propaganda for a period of time. There'll be others who, I mean, absolutely tragically are living under that occupation, but whose sentiment, whose allegiances are entirely towards Ukraine and not able to speak Ukrainian because it's dangerous, listen to songs, publicly sort of read Ukrainian books and so on. That, I think, and what you've said there, really undermines one of the narratives that are starting to appear. I suspect it's either driven by useful idiots or amplified by Russian assets in the media, academia, and so on. That is that somehow it's a stalemate, and therefore that means a negotiation is required with the aggressor. Now, for me and for many others who've been sort of observing this, and every single Ukrainian I've spoken to, the idea of negotiating with Putin and his regime is beyond absurd. There is no grounds whatsoever for even engaging in that delusion, and no hope whatsoever that any agreement would be rational, fair, or binding. I mean, I'd like you to talk about that, but also where this is coming from and how Russia is able to plant and amplify these narratives amongst Western diplomats, press, academia, and so on.
Well, Russia seeking negotiations and then sending around 90 rockets and 30 drones our way yesterday is a bit of a contradiction, right? We cannot really trust them when they say that they seek peace. And regarding that the will of Ukrainians to sort of let go of the currently occupied territories, we have to appreciate that almost every Ukrainian has sacrificed something huge and irreplaceable already in this war. A family member fighting on the front line who has been either killed or critically wounded, or they have like a family member or their house in occupation. And what this occupation means is torture. It's not just the ban on the Ukrainian language and the expression of Ukrainian identity, which our allies often imagine occupation to be. It's torture. It's being treated as like not second-class citizens, but actually non-human disposables by the occupiers. It's willful killing of civilians. It's that there is no choice between freedom and life as it's usually presented by those who lean towards the Russian narrative about the occupied territories. There is no choice between life and freedom. Russians take both. First they take your freedom, then they take your life. And there is no choice between. There are no two options. I'm a friend of someone who was killed in the Russian attack on a peaceful city in the east of the country. It's a fantastic, brilliant Ukrainian writer, Victoria Melina, who was at the time of her death writing a book about war crime researchers, people in the occupied territories, and about all the methods that Russians used to subjugate Ukrainians. And one of the cases that she investigated was the death of the Ukrainian children's author Volodymyr Vakulenko, who was staying in his native village of Kapitolivka in the Kharkiv region at the time when Russians invaded Ukraine in February 2022. He stayed there with his teenage disabled son, but he was known for his Ukrainian position by his fellow villagers. So at some point, Russians just took him to the torture chamber, and they shot him, and they buried him in one of the mass graves. So in the Kharkiv region, we know we've uncovered these mass graves near Izum when the Ukrainian army liberated the region. So there is no choice of letting all these people in torture chambers and in the cells in prison cells be subjected to the continued torture and death by the occupiers. We cannot accept that, because these people are our friends, our acquaintances, or our relatives. Ukrainians will fight to liberate these territories, and our success is largely dependent on the aid we receive from our allies. The Russian narrative that has been about the stalemate that has been pushed forward in the international media sort of tries to hide the fact that Russian fleet has been deflated by a country with no fleet whatsoever. Ukrainians do not have a Black Sea fleet, and yet they used smart military tactics to reduce the number of Russian warships and to push them out of the Black Sea. There is no stalemate. Wherever we can fight smartly and cleverly, we do that. And wherever we depend on the timely provision of the necessary military aid from the West, we still fight with whatever we have at our hands. So the stalemate is largely the construction that helps to justify Western indecisiveness and inaction. I always say Western, which is a cliche that I have in my head. Obviously, we have allies not only in Northern America and in Western Europe, but around the globe.
Korea, Japan. I mean, there are many there, and that's actually quite important, because this inaction not only extends to the provision of weaponry and capability, it also extends to war readiness and ramping up our industries for war production, putting our economies on a war footing. None of that has happened. Some factories have been dusted off. There has been maybe, I think, a sort of doubling or so of the US production of artillery and rounds and so on. But even so, the amount of artillery rounds the US could produce would last no more than apparently about 2 weeks on the front in Ukraine, given the intensity of fighting. And this is another reason, I think, why the stalemate narrative is just so absurd. Ukraine, a country far smaller than Russia, and that was predicted to fall within 3 days. Well, we know that was nonsensical to start with. But Ukraine has been able to hold Russia, apparently the world's second largest army, at bay for 2 years. And throughout this year, even though the front lines have not changed significantly, Ukraine has been able to attrit Russian forces to the point where around Avdiivka, they were driving in 1930s trucks. You have museum pieces, tanks as museum pieces, being trundled up to the front and used as artillery. You have appalling kind of uniform supplies and these ridiculous meat wave attacks. You've been able to attrit and degrade the world's largest military and show it up for the kind of Potemkin sick joke that it actually is, rather than a force that can actually achieve anything militarily. That I would class as an extraordinary success, not a stalemate. Why does the media reach for these simplistic and lazy narratives?
Not to put my thoughts in the head of the media, but I agree with you that it's lazy thinking. And when the current situation on the battlefield in Ukraine requires from us in the West some unity and some action, it might be just easier to say, oh my God, it's too hard to fight against a huge 140 million of Russians, this huge manpower. Ukraine is exhausted by war. It's a smaller economy, it's a smaller country, and it was hopeless from the start. They're losing their best people on the battlefield, and perhaps we just should call it a game. But I mean, what we have to remember is that any peace negotiations or any stop of Ukrainian counteroffensive would mean that Russia would just rearm and continue its fight against other territories of Ukraine, which it has not yet occupied, and then it will move further. Anyone who would risk their mental health and listen to a talk show on a Russian TV would know that they consider the Baltic states, Poland, and countries further west, Finland, of course, Sweden, as their adversaries, and that they threaten them as well with military expansion. Ukraine just happens to be the first country in the line. What really saddens me is that Russians have been banking on Western decadence and on the fact that these individualistic democratic societies would not be able to maintain the level of support to Ukraine that would allow Ukrainians to fight. And so far, Ukrainians continue fighting because they have no choice, as we have discussed. But our allies do really show the signs of decadence and, you know, this perpetual tiredness and exhaustion. The further you are from the actual front line, the more chances to get tired and exhausted you have. We have to remember that it's not countries outside of Ukraine who are actually fighting, who are actually in the trenches, who are actually sacrificing their health and their lives. It's Ukrainians who are doing this job. And what is expected from our allies is just to understand the gravity of the question. I'm puzzled by this thought. Can you imagine a world without Ukraine? Because there is a possibility that we lose this war. There is a possibility because we're smaller and we have less people than Russia. What kind of world would that be? What would be the meanings of the words like democracy, solidarity, I don't know, democratic values, courage, resistance, resilience in such a world where Ukraine loses to Russia?
And what would Europe be like with 40 million refugees? I mean, this is a question which I argued to an extent with I don't think she was a diplomat. I think she was more of a sort of foreign policy type expert. And I think this person would think of themselves as being extremely pro-Ukrainian. And yet she expressed a high degree of concern. And I think that concern actually translates into limiting self-regulating behavior on the part of Western allies. And this is their so-called uneasiness at the idea that the linchpin of this war is actually Crimea. And yet I think that evokes a queasiness in many decision makers who don't quite understand what's going on. The idea that Ukraine, given the right weaponry, would be guaranteed to take Crimea, attack and take Crimea. I think many military experts like Ben Hodges say that this actually is the way the war ends. This is probably the only way the war ends, because that would trigger the collapse and fall of Putin's regime, if not a wider collapse and fall within Russia. And I think these are the two things that regulate Western behaviors here in not supplying Ukraine what it needs. I mean, I'm on the position that we need to oversupply Ukraine everything it needs to absolutely guarantee that it's got everything in a timely fashion, not undersupply. But I think these two factors, fearing a Russian collapse and fearing the consequences of large-scale fighting on the Crimean Peninsula, why should we not fear either of those two things? And this isn't to convince me. This is to convince anyone watching who.
It's a bit pathetic, isn't it? The fear of Russian collapse that is stronger than the fear of Russian success, which would mean the defeat of a sovereign, independent, democratic state that is Ukraine, and that has been fighting like fiercely throughout these 10 years of war. And it would send the signal to autocrats worldwide that it is possible in the current world and its state of decadence and lethargy to do such a thing. And we will be sending signals to not only to Russia that it can expand its imperialistic daydreaming, but also to Iran, to North Korea, to China, who is treated in the US as the major danger. Yeah, so I think that the fear of the Russian defeat is probably the most pathetic aspect of our times, and we should get rid of that, not to become a laughingstock. Regarding Crimea, obviously, the war has to end in Crimea, because it was land grab by Russia at the point when Ukraine was weakened. Our corrupt and murderous president Viktor Yanukovych had just fled, and the country was just, reestablishing all its processes, and Russia used this opportunity to make a move. And it wasn't punished in 2014 for this. And if we allow Russia to go unpunished, it will not become the last war of Russia. It will be the new beginning for this imperialist age for Russia. We are all interested in this to be the last war of Russia. And if it means the disintegration of the Russian Federation, its disarming and its decolonization, well, the better for all of us, right? The peoples inside the Russian Federation will have a chance to define their own destiny and to think about what kind of country they would want to build.
And this is where Western weakness, indecision, and failure to understand not just Putin's mindset, I'm going to call it the Russian imperial mindset, because Putin may go, but there's a recent interview I did with Yuri Felshtinsky said, there are hundreds, there are thousands of Putins, all just queuing up, waiting to take the throne. What they're inheriting is something called the Sistema. They're inheriting a imperialist, now highly aggressive, war-dependent, bureaucratic, vertical kleptocracy. It's not going to be disbanded and taken apart overnight. In fact, most people queuing up to assume power, taking it apart is the opposite of what they want to do. They want to, you know, put their trotters in the trough and become part of that system. And I think it's a failure to recognize that and to focus on, it's going to upset some people, marginal figures who are never going to assume power like Navalny and others, and even focus on these sort of puppet politicians and assume that somehow they are genuine. Sobchak is a classic example of that, an absolute establishment puppet, which the Western media still seem to write about as if she's some kind of independent agent with any kind of political agency within Russia. Western weakness also extends down to Central Asia, because if Russia is unsuccessful in Ukraine, it cannot physically get to, or it can get to the Baltics, but it cannot physically get to those other territories in Europe that it is threatening. So where might it turn its aggressive attention? Where is there maybe tens of millions of new bodies it could absorb into its army? And that, of course, is Central Asia. And we hear the Z patriots and bloggers. It's unfortunately, like yourself, I do listen to a lot of that highly toxic material, and it's important to do so. And they're making ever more bellicose threats against Central Asia, specifically Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, two countries which actually have been the least Russophobic of any, and the people there are in shock at some of these statements coming out. But if the Russians' war economy, war machine is to keep ticking over, it will have to absorb other states and incorporate those populations into its military machine. So what are the wider risks of Western inaction?
Well, basically, the criminal that goes unpunished continues to commit crimes, right? And the crimes of Russia, as you rightly point out, will be directed again internally against the people it has already colonized, and it will expand, if not westwards, then eastwards and to the south, because currently this war hysteria is, from what I can see, is the only uniting factor within the Russian Federation. Otherwise, they're quite spineless or atomized individuals who do not see themselves as the society. What defines them as the society is imperialism and this bloodthirsty desire to expand. So, it's a black hole that keeps expanding, and we keep feeding it our best people, and this has to be stopped. And when Russia is met with resistance, it will stop. And the only way to show this kind of resistance is, military means. It has to be defeated militarily. And in that case, countries that are also considering this kind of expansion will think twice, and regimes, autocratic regimes worldwide, will think twice about what it would cost them. We have to think about the ways of making the Russian people accountable for what they have committed in Ukraine. We have to think about crimes not only against the people of Ukraine, but also against the environment in Ukraine, because now what they have committed extends the limits of imaginable. The destruction of the Kakhovka dam, which led to the flooding of southern Ukraine, the most fertile agricultural lands in the country, the mining of 1/3 of Ukrainian territory, which the mined territories in Ukraine are larger than England and Scotland, I think, combined, right?
And at the current rate, it would take hundreds of years to fully demine the territory, given the scale of that. That's why there are a lot of people, I've spoken to a few, who are trying to think of novel technologies and techniques to increase the rapidity of demining and, of course, the accuracy of that process, because we don't want, farmers in future decades being sort of blown up by these munitions. Russia, as you'd expect, almost certainly has made no record whatsoever of where these mines are physically distributed, no maps, which I mean, not only is this illegal, but keeping no record of the territories it's demined is against the rules of war there. I mean, this is where Ukrainian innovation comes in, but those territories have to be liberated first.
But it
And
shows you something about the Russian treatment of the territories it wants to liberate or whatever it wants to do with them. If they were into like the development of these territories or like into the investment into these territories, they would show a different kind of behavior. But if they just saw these lands with landmines, it is clear that it's not the welfare of the people or even the natural resources that they're interested in extracting. They just making these lands unlivable for Ukrainians and for Russians and for anyone, literally.
And it's worse. I'm not sure, and I'd like you to address this. I'm not sure the full horror of this is really understood in the West, and not just the media, the public as well. Rightly, 20 years ago, people were outraged at ethnic cleansing and ethnic massacres in Bosnia by the fascistic Serb forces, allies of Russia, of course. But that was on a scale. I mean, the horror of that is undeniable. But that was on a scale which is minute compared to what's happening. It's not just that Russia wants to occupy territories. It's not just they want to liberate Russian, so-called Russian-speaking areas. It's far more pernicious than that now. I think, as you said earlier, they've realized that the spirit of Maidan, which they see as a kind of infection, a kind of disease, has infected almost all Ukrainians. And from what I hear from the various interviews I've done, Russia looks on suspicion at anyone who's Ukrainian, Russian speaking or otherwise. They no longer make the distinction. So it seems the plan, and Mariupol is a good example of that. Their plan is actually to fully ethnically cleanse everybody who's Ukrainian from the territory, and then seed those territories with not just sort of Russians and peasants from the provinces, but also people from Central Asia, migrants and so on. We're talking about one of the largest ethnic cleansings since the Stalin era. And we're talking about a pure Stalinist policy here as well. That seems to me not understood or discussed nearly enough in the West.
I probably can talk about one of the projects that I'm curating here. It's called People of Culture Taken Away by the War. It's a project that is led by PEN Ukraine in a partnership with the Ukrainians media. We write up stories of Ukrainian people of culture, artists, composers, conductors, writers, poets, film directors, musicians, who have been murdered by Russians in this invasion after either on the front lines or in peaceful cities when they were bombarded or in the occupied territories. And the scale of this crime against the cultural sector of the society, who are like in some ways represent the identity. They compose this fabric of Ukrainian culture. They are the people whose work, either like in the library or in an orchestra, is what makes Ukrainian culture what it is. Russians have been basically eradicating this layer of Ukrainian society. Some scholars, like Tamara Hundurova, for example, call it culture-cide. Erasure of this cultural sector is one of the dimensions of a genocide, right? It's one of the aspects that define genocide. So we have to keep this in mind. But obviously, like Ukrainian cultural figures are not the only ones against the ethnic cleansing is directed. Russia is erasing whole cities, whole towns in eastern and southern Ukraine. If you look at the pictures of Mariinka, for example, or currently Avdiivka, where one of my friends is currently fighting, which were like populous, prospering cities in Ukraine with their own cultural identity. There is, a hole in the earth, burnt earth right now in the place where these towns and cities used to be. And I don't think that the scale of this genocide is recognized outside of Ukraine. You need to have a powerful imagination, or you need to be like immersed, unhealthily immersed, like we are in the news coming from Ukraine, to actually comprehend the scale of this erasure that is going on.
And unhealthily immersed in Russian history. I mean, I was the guy who would talk to people about Russian history in the pub, to the point where you end up sitting on your own if you do that too much, because it's extremely depressing. And Russians themselves shy away. The 90s opened up a lot of truth, and even then, a lot of people didn't want to hear it because it's hard work to re-examine all of the tropes and the myths and the lies that you've been brought up with. And even if you accept those for myths and lies, it's endlessly painful to dive into the details of that, and all the artists who are shot, all the works that were not created, all the human potential that is erased and destroyed from every country in the Soviet Union where that happened. And I think this is why Putin is so successful. He said, you don't have to worry about this stuff anymore. You can forget it. You can believe our lies. You cannot believe our lies. But we're going to take away all responsibility from you. You're not going to have to think about this bad stuff anymore. It's all going to go away. Everything's going to be lovely. Well, of course, everything's not lovely. And now that is turning full circle. That historical amnesia is now causing people to, even those who are so-called loyalists, are being consumed by the terror machine that he's created. And that's only going to get more and more intense. But yes, we need to get people to focus on this.
Just to illustrate what the point you've been making, I think there is no more vivid illustration of this amnesia than the Russian occupation of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, right? They invaded Ukraine from the north in February 2022, and they went through the Chornobyl exclusion zone, which is the contaminated territory. And in the heavily contaminated territory of which is called like the rest forest, because the forest turned red because of the nuclear contamination. In this contaminated territory, Russians did dig their trenches. They went about the exclusion zone without paying any attention to their safety from nuclear exposure, radioactive exposure. And it would be just unthinkable in Ukraine, where every school kid is brought up with the knowledge of what the Chernobyl disaster was, what the consequences for our territory and for our people were. For Russians, this largest nuclear catastrophe in history is just non-existent. And their behavior in the Chernobyl exclusion zone is the proof of that. And it seems like this amnesia about their past crimes of the Soviet regime or of the Russian Empire, is what defines the continued repetition of these crimes. They have not been punished, they have not been stopped, and they continue doing the same thing all over again. The occupation of objects of civilian nuclear infrastructure in Ukraine is one of the signals of that. We cannot rely on Russians to hold themselves accountable for this. We need to hold them accountable for their crimes. And maybe this is the only way that they will learn. but their learning process is not my concern. My concern is the justice for Ukrainian people.
That's it, and people shouldn't have illusions about a so-called revolution happening in Russia, because what you have there is I'm not sure there's a real word for it, but it's a sort of radical anti-empathy. Um, if people are protesting, and a few women are protesting, it's not that they're protesting to save somebody else's husband. They're only going out to save their own. So there's a radical sort of self-centeredness, and the system itself over many decades has been constructed in the Soviet Union to erase the bonds between humans, any sense of responsibility, self-organization, and so on. What I find more and more remarkable about it is not that there's the absence of these values in Russia, but that these values were preserved in Ukraine. I mean, that for me is why it's been so fascinating over the last 2 years, just to say how you've got this thing and it's it's been dipped in acid, you've scrubbed away at it, you've tried to erase these values, and they just keep re-emerging and re-emerging, no matter how hard Russia has tried to erase them. That, I think, is the extraordinary aspect of it. But it also means that these values of empathy and self-organization, responsibility, have been successfully destroyed in Russia. It means that civil society, when it emerges, is anemic, extremely small scale and weak, not totally absent, but it certainly isn't reaching any kind of threshold for the kind of revolutions that we've seen over and over in Ukraine. So we shouldn't have any hope of radical change within Russia shortcutting the war. Maybe another mutiny might do that, or a sort of FSB coup, but that's maybe about the only thing we can hope for.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you. There is no impetus towards self-organization and no impetus towards imagining themselves as a society, which is at stark contrast with what I'm witnessing and experiencing in Ukraine. People to whom you talk always jump from this individual level towards a social level. They are never stuck in this loop of individual self-reflection, what I can do for my own welfare. They always think about what I can do for my community or for my city or for my country. There is this, I'm sure like you're talking to this in every interview, fantastic Ukrainian volunteers movement. I'll just give you two examples. One is the weaving of camouflage nets here in Lviv, which is happening in a local library and which has been going on for 2 years. So people, volunteers gather in this library and weave these nets that then mask Ukrainian equipment, or they weave the galley suits for Ukrainian soldiers so that they are merged with the natural environment. And there are always from 10 to 15 people in this library immersed in this work, and they come from all layers of the society, from various social groups, and it's a continued effort. They feel like they have to give. If they can't go to the front line and actually defend their country with arms, they have to give something, their free time, their effort to this. And the other example is my friends in Kyiv, one of whom you know very well. It's Maria Shuvalova, who is a fantastic dedicated volunteer who's always fundraising for the army. And these days, they are going around offices and public places and singing Ukrainian traditional Christmas carols, and also raising money for the army, for the brigades that they are supporting. And it's 5, 6 wonderful young Ukrainian women who are all successful in their professions and who cannot imagine a better way of spending their very few free days in the year than, again, like dressing up, learning Ukrainian traditional songs, going out and trying to raise even more for the army and buy some of the essentials for, again, their loved ones who are serving.
That's absolutely extraordinary. And I find those stories so incredibly heartening, because it's not just people saying, you know, we need money, etc. It's these creative techniques that help reinforce identity, morale, and that will also do good at the same time. Well, we're nearing the end, and I'm aware that you've probably got a million things you need to be doing. I could definitely talk all day, but that we'll try and do a sort of talking marathon on another occasion, and maybe do a
Well,
fundraiser around that. That'd be good. I think a fundraiser early in the new year would be a good idea.
brilliant.
And I'll have all my, you know, throat sweets and various remedies there to do that. But let's focus on next year, because the West needs to, I would say, crudely grow a pair. It needs to get its act in order. What needs to happen in order to ensure an overwhelming and just Ukrainian victory?
I don't know. I think it all comes from the morale, right? When I start hearing the whining from international criminal court lawyers that they cannot persecute Russians for their war crimes, and it will take up to 300 years to actually make Russians accountable, I have to remind them that we do not have this time. I have one earthly life, and we have to make sure that justice is served to the Ukrainian people in our lifetime, if not in the next 2 years. So just to keep the urgency of the matter in mind would be very helpful. We do not need support for as long as it takes. We need support now, while there is still a country that we are defending, while we are still alive and are able to continue defending it, and, you know, while we are still in existence. So I think that the urgency needs to come first. And once this urgency becomes, you know, the constant in our framework, all the actions will follow, right? We need military aid. We need F-16s, and not 3 of them, but we need a fleet. And yeah, we basically need political discords in the countries of our allies to be put aside, and to understand that Ukrainian victory and Ukrainian survival is not a bargaining matter. It is something that will define our lifetime in Ukraine and beyond. And once this is a constant in our framework, I think all the operationals will follow.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I also think the spirit of Maidan and the forces it's unleashed, the political forces, are essential for the renewal of our own democracy. And if we allow that light to go out, then our own systems, our own values will be deeply impoverished. So I hope people are listening to this. Sasha, stay safe. Thank you so much. Incredibly grateful to you speaking for us again. And this being the last interview of the year, I really hope it has an impact on people and sets the right mindset for 2020, 2024. Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
Heroям Slava. Thank you for everything that you are doing, Jonathan, and happy new year, and hope you have a peaceful holiday ahead.